Welcome, everybody. It's good to see you all. Welcome to what has turned out to be the first Tocqueville event of the spring semester. Most of you will know that we had planned an event for January 27th and 28th on the American Constitution, but this thing called an ice storm forced us to cancel the lectures. But you'll be happy to know that we are going to try to salvage a small part of that event for late in March. So watch your emails for updates. If you came in the door, you should have gotten a brochure. It looks like there we go. It looks like this. So in it has a lot of information about, well, we have one more big event in March, but things that you can see from past lectures, but also there are QR codes in there if you want to find out more about the Tocqueville Center. If we have never met, my name is Brent Nelson, and I am the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. If you are new to the Tocqueville Center, we are a group of faculty and students committed to seeking the truth and cultivating thoughtful, informed, and ethical citizens through the exploration of the great questions that shape political, economic, religious, and social life in America and the wider world. We are exploring all that Alexis de Tocqueville, the French aristocrat who traveled to the United States in the early 1830s and published his seminal work, Democracy in America, in 2 volumes in 1835 and 1840. We want to know what he also sought to understand. Like Tocqueville, we too wish to comprehend what it means for a free people to govern themselves. If you are a student and you wish to join us in this endeavor, there are 2 ways to do it. The Tocqueville Fellows are dedicated to this project and wish to go deeper. They make a significant weekly commitment of time and energy to explore the big questions. Applications for next year's Fellows are now open. Just use that QR code on the screen and you'll find the application. If you're not willing or able to make a big commitment to Tocqueville, but still want to be involved in some discussions about the topics explored by our guest speakers, then Beaumont Fellows is for you. There's no application for Beaumont Fellows. All you have to do is get your name on our list and you will begin to get information on Beaumont activities. There's a QR code for you as well. Finally, if you are a member of OLLI, and you know who you are because your hair looks like mine, and want to be part of the Tocqueville Special Interest Group, please see Al. He's somewhere. There he is, way over there. Al or Mary Jo. Mary Jo's sometimes here, but Al will get you all signed up for the Tocqueville Special Interest Group. And we do things together. Beaumont Fellows and OLLI get together and talk about the guest speakers and the things that the issues that they raise. So it's a good time. But now to the event. The United States has never conducted its foreign policy guided purely by the dictates of power politics. We have always believed we were in some way a force for good in the world, a great power that acted with moral purpose. Sometimes we took up the banner of righteousness and proclaimed our cause as God's cause. Sometimes we were more subtle and merely claimed to be promoting universal principles of human rights and democracy through our actions in the world. We surely sacrificed our blood and treasure for causes we knew to be right and just, but sometimes we used the language of morality to cover what we knew to be self-interested power plays. Mark Amstutz, our speaker tonight, has been exploring the relationship between moral principles and national foreign policies for over 4 decades. He is professor of political science emeritus at Wheaton College, where he was, in fact, my professor and academic advisor when I was at Wheaton. Professor Amstutz grew up in Latin America. He came to the United States for his education, where he earned his BA at Houghton College and his MA and PhD at American University. For more than a decade, he served as a reserve naval attaché, retiring as a commander from the U.S. Naval Reserve in 1993. He has written many books, including Christian Ethics and U.S. Foreign Policy, The Healing of Nations, The Promise and Limits of Political Forgiveness, Evangelicals in American Foreign Policy, and Just Immigration, U.S. Policy in Christian Perspective. His textbook, International Ethics, is a seminal text in this field, now in its 6th edition, the 6th edition out just last year. His most recent book is Building World Order, How the Christian Faith Fosters Global Peace, Prosperity, and Justice, and it was also published in 2025. Tonight, Professor Amstutz will speak to us on the church and global peace. After his talk, I will introduce our panel participants, and we will end with questions from you all. So please welcome Professor Mark Amstutz.
Thank you, Brent, and it's a joy to be on this campus, beautiful campus. I was here some 20 years ago, I believe, for a conference, and I have always admired Furman, especially its political science program. When I was chair in developing the department, one of the things that caught my attention about Furman was they had all these Truman Fellows, and I had tried repeatedly. I got in my course in doing this work, I think there were 2 or 3 finalists, but I never got one past the final gate. So my congratulations to Furman and your outstanding program. I think currently the president of Finland is a graduate of your department. So anyway, I'm impressed. The title of my talk tonight is, Can the Church Contribute to Global Peace and Prosperity? The word church here refers not to denominations and buildings, but rather to the body of Christ in the world, the believers committed to authentic discipleship. Can Anglicans, Pentecostals, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Southern Baptists, Catholics, and other believers help to make the world a better place? That's the question. I'm a scholar of international relations and a disciple of Jesus Christ. And while my talk builds on the work that I've carried out over many decades, my reflections this evening come primarily, or in part at least, from this recently published book, Building World Order. Before proceeding, let me say a few things about my life. I do so because all of us have unique biographies that influence how we view the world, and I'd like to give you some information how I have sought to view my faith and politics. Although numerous developments have influenced my life and work, I highlight 3 things, 3 factors. First, I grew up in Chile in the 1950s, and as a child, I saw enormous poverty. I often got on my bicycle, rain or shine, and bought 8 to 10 loaves of bread to distribute to poor people who would come to our home. And I shall always remember the faces of little boys and little girls who would come to our door in the dead of winter and ask for bread. With rain-soaked bodies and their bodies shivering from the cold, they would say, "Dame un pasito pan, por favor." Give me a piece of bread. In my 45 years of teaching, I have never lost sight of that vision of human need. Secondly, in the fall of 1963, I participated in a Washington, D.C. seminar on governmental affairs. The seminar, which brought together some 30 college students, was designed to provide an overview of governmental affairs. And in one of the presentations, I heard a Department of State official describe how U.S. government was distributing small programmed radios with the aim of encouraging literacy in the highlands of Peru. At the end of the diplomat's brief presentation, he suggested that some of us should consider working for the U.S. government to help advance human dignity. Although I did not realize it at the time, this was like a born-again experience for me. It transformed my life. I began reading the New York Times, staying abreast of foreign affairs. And although I never became a full-time government official, in my time as a professor at Wheaton, I regularly encourage students to consider public service vocations. In fact, this book and the 6th edition of Ethics is dedicated to students who have served and continue to serve in non-governmental or governmental affairs, because I think the public sector is essential to the common good. Third, I approached my role as a citizen and believer from a Reformed theological perspective. In his classic Christ and Culture, H. Richard Niebuhr identifies 5 ways that Christians have historically related faith to society. To my mind, the 3 most significant of these are, first, Christ above culture, which is essentially the Catholic perspective. Second, Christ and culture in paradox approach, which characterizes Lutheran theology. And third, Christ transforming culture, which is the Calvinist or the Reformed perspective. I identify with this last approach because I believe that Christians have a responsibility to be salt and light in all aspects of society. Believers fulfill the creation mandate, in my view, by caring for creation and the communities of which they are a part. However, whether people use a Lutheran, Catholic, or Reformed perspective, it is important to recognize that no single theological approach provides an authoritative way of advancing the kingdom of God on earth. The reason for this is simple. The divine strategy in the world is, to use Niebuhr's words, quote, in the mind of the captain rather than of any lieutenants, end of quote. Thus, it behooves Christians to proceed with humility when integrating Christian morality with public affairs. Now, if Christians are to contribute to the task of building a more peaceful and humane world, they must possess biblical and political knowledge. I've got some water here, thank you. So let me offer some brief reflections on the Bible as a source of political reflection and action, and then some comments about the structure and problems of contemporary global order. First, the Bible and politics. By the way, I understand scholars tend to say more and more about less and less. I'm being very unscholarly this evening with creating very broad brush strokes with the intent of trying to inspire action that integrates faith and politics. The Bible is God's revelation for authentic discipleship. It is not a manual on government. Scripture offers principles, perspectives, and moral rules that can serve as a guide or map to structure social and political analysis and decision-making. But it is not a manual on how to run government or structure the international community. In The Code of Peace, Dorothy Jones synthesizes the complex body of international law, multilateral treaties, and conventions into a body of 9 core tenets. Using Jones' approach as a model, I set forth a biblical code, some of the most important principles from Scripture relevant to social and political life. My aim is to highlight fundamental biblical truths that are relevant to public affairs. Some of its core elements include principles such as 1, God is sovereign over nations. 2, states are morally legitimate. 3, all persons are morally equal and entitled to dignity. 4, sin is personal, ubiquitous, and universal. 5, love is essential in sustaining human relationships. 6, the moral standard for all communities is justice. 7, Christians are called to be peacemakers. And 8, believers have dual citizenship in the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of earth. And when conflict arises between these two realms, believers must give precedence to the divine over the temporal. Since a large body of scholarship exists on theological and political ethics, this simple model provides a preliminary and incomplete way of addressing social and political concerns. I'm also well aware that each of these ideas can be defined and applied in different ways. Still, the minimalist account has the advantage of helping to highlight the relevance of faith to temporal challenges of contemporary political life. While Protestants and Catholics concur on most fundamental issues of political ethics, the Catholic Church has developed a body of church teachings on social and political life that is significantly more nuanced and developed than the teachings from Protestantism. This tradition, known as Catholic social thought, relies on scripture, reason, and tradition. Although much of the work of the Catholic approach is theoretical and philosophical, its core elements have been distilled into a core body of teachings. Some of its most important elements include the following 5 principles. 1, solidarity, which is the priority of communal life. 2, the common good, which highlights a community's welfare. 3, personalism, which emphasizes the dignity of persons. 4, subsidiarity, which calls for decentralized decision-making and action. And 5, participation, which emphasizes political and social engagement in society. However we define biblical and political ethics, it is clear that a substantial body of concepts, ideas, and principles are available to assess believers in bringing a Christian worldview to bear on national and global affairs. Now let me turn to global politics. If you were to look at a globe of the world, what do you see? Do you see different continents with boundaries of nation states, or do you see a single global society? If you see both, which is more important and why? While scholars hold many different theories and approaches to international affairs, I believe these various perspectives can be reduced to 2, namely realism and idealism. The first approach views the world as it currently is, while the second approaches the world from an idealistic perspective in order to overcome the limits and shortcomings of the current system of nation states. The first is more empirical, the second more normative. Since diplomats and government decision makers are chiefly concerned with contemporary problems and challenges like peacekeeping and nuclear proliferation, they tend to be realists. By contrast, political thinkers, philosophers, religious leaders tend to focus on how to overcome the limitations of the existing global order and therefore tend to be idealistic. For example, William Kavanaugh, professor of religion, argues that the church must reject its focus of the nation state. In his view, quote, "A world without borders is a peaceful world, a world where all may be one," end of quote. I think Kavanaugh is wrong. In my view, if you want a better world, you need strong states that are good. The basic building block of the international community is the nation state. To the extent that the world has a constitutional order, it is defined by the United Nations Charter, which assumes that the world is an international society of nation states. According to the Charter, member states agree to respect the political independence of other states and to avoid using force in settling disputes. The aim of the UN is to encourage a peaceful and prosperous world. Further, while the Charter specifies the major rights and duties of member states, and this is important, it avoids specifying how governments should be constituted or how they should carry out their domestic responsibilities. And that creates an enormous amount of problems in the world. Thus, if Christians are to help address the issues and problems in the international community, they need to approach issues with knowledge of the world as it is. The nation state has many limitations and shortcomings, but human rights and prosperity are possible only in stable societies where the government is reasonably effective in maintaining public order, ensuring the rule of law, and advancing economic welfare. The task of building a better world, however, does not end with the focus of the nation state. In one of his poems, John Donne, the famous 16th century cleric and writer, observes, "No man is an island. Since humans are social by nature, the flourishing of individuals must always be carried out within the context of society. Similarly, no nation is an island. If nations are to develop and thrive, they can only do so in the context of relations with other nations. The international community is simply the byproduct of international relations among states. Global society emerged because states need to interact with other states to advance their national interests. Now, the fundamental problem in building an international community or global society out of distinct sovereign states is how to establish and maintain international order. An international order, an international community can only exist if a fundamental order is prevalent. No order, no global society. And if the world is not relatively stable and harmonious, peace, prosperity, and justice will remain elusive. More significantly, however, Christians must be concerned with the world because of God's love is universal. This means that believers must be concerned not simply with their own communities, but also with foreign societies. The concern for the world's welfare explains why Christians have been at the forefront of advancing human dignity in foreign lands. Sociologist Robert Woodbury, a former student, has shown with detailed empirical work that Protestant missionaries in the 18th and 19th century played a key role in advancing human welfare among indigenous peoples. Since missionaries believed that all persons were entitled to dignity, they built schools, clinics to care for the needy. In particular, missionaries were responsible for increasing literacy, fostering gender equality, and improving living conditions. Thus far, I have offered reflections on biblical ethics and highlighted some key elements of global society. I next turn to the challenge of political witness, the third part of my talk. So how can Christians using biblical and theological knowledge contribute to global order and specific problems that beset our contemporary world? How should believers integrate a Christian perspective with important global concerns? Let me address the issue of focus first. Should the institutional church act like a political interest group or a moral teacher? Should the church seek to address specific problems or focus on building a moral infrastructure or scaffolding that can help structure political and policy analysis? In my view, the church should be the church. It should function as a Christian embassy in secular society. The church should be concerned with the moral formation of its members so that it can illuminate and apply biblical morality to temporal political concerns. If the church does not teach and encourage biblical morality, such as truth-telling, promise-keeping, forgiveness, compassion for the needy, the priority of reconciliation, who is to do this? Michael Novak, in his book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, argues that fundamental institutions of society are based on three interrelated systems: an economic system, a political system, and a moral cultural system. Since the institutions and political debates in society are necessarily rooted in cultural values and moral dispositions of society, at least this is the case in democratic societies, the foundation for a society's economic and political order must necessarily be rooted in people's prevailing beliefs and values. And if this is the case, churches should wisely seek to advance the public welfare not so much by addressing specific political and economic issues, but cultivating a biblical morality that can influence and structure analysis and action. How should believers address issues like failed states, illegal migration, climate change, nuclear proliferation? Well, I have suggested that the organized church should avoid policy advocacy. I believe that Christians working individually and collectively need to be involved in all aspects of social and political life. There may be occasions when government threatens the core mission of the church, and the church must respond and oppose government action directly. This, of course, was a situation that Dietrich Bonhoeffer faced in the mid-1930s in Nazi Germany. It is also the situation in South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s, when believers had to confront the Afrikaners' Dutch Reformed Church's support for apartheid. But for most issues and concerns, however, the task of bringing a Christian perspective to bear on political issues is best undertaken by individual believers acting individually and collectively, apart from the organized, established denominations and churches. The task of integrating faith and public policy is especially difficult. To my mind, one of the best illustrations of how to do this is the American Catholic Church's 1983 pastoral letter on nuclear strategy. Titled The Challenge of Peace, the document provides a competent definition of the moral problems posed by nuclear weapons and provides a moral framework for assessing the ongoing debate about U.S. nuclear strategy. While the letter was officially adopted by the Conference of U.S. Catholic Bishops, the drafting of the document was undertaken by a group of church leaders, defense specialists, scientists, international relations scholars over a 3-year period. In fact, the lead thinker on that was priest Brian Hare, who was a student of Stanley Hoffman at Harvard University. And his influence, and what's interesting is he made the cover story of Time magazine, and I invited him about a month later, and he came to campus and explained his role in the drafting of that important document. The drafting committee shared 2 preliminary drafts in order to encourage broad public discussion and debate. When the final document was released, the media gave broad coverage to the report. Indeed, the New York Times placed the bishop's letter on the front page and devoted nearly 2 full pages to the actual report itself. I know of no document that's been issued by any church body in the years since then that has gotten that kind of impact. Why was the pastoral letter influential? Because it was authoritative. Thus, if Christians are to address important global issues, they need to be able to define problems competently and dispassionately, and then show how Christian values and principles relate to the issue. The strength of the pastoral letter was not its recommendations and conclusions. Rather, its influence derived from its sophisticated moral analysis, an analysis that helped to educate military and political leaders as well as the lay public. I now turn to my fourth part of my talk, and I want to illustrate the challenging task of integrating faith by exploring a very divisive and polarizing issues, namely international migration. I got interested in the immigration issue when the National Association of Evangelicals issued a short two-page resolution in 2009, which, among other things, concluded that the U.S. government wasn't issuing enough visas to meet the demands for workers and family reunification. The problem of unauthorized migration, according to the document's drafters, was thus a failure of government policy, one that could be remedied by establishing a more generous, flexible system. When I began looking into this issue, it was clear that other Christian denominations were also calling for immigration reforms that would, among other things, strengthen due process protection for migrants, facilitate an increase in family reunification, and provide legal status to the large group of unauthorized aliens living in the United States. I had no problem with these and other recommendations. My concern were that religious groups were failing to offer a comprehensive definition of the problem of mass migration or to provide a compelling biblical and moral analysis of the challenges resulting from irregular migration. Most troubling, some Christians group questioned the legitimacy of existing laws and governmental institutions and focused exclusively on migrants' welfare. For some, the fundamental message of Scripture was that we should welcome the stranger. According to the United Nations Organization for Migration, in 2025, there were some 304 million international migrants, that is, people living outside of their homeland. This does not include the people who are traveling on a temporary basis. These are people who are established outside of their homeland. And since the number of 1990, the number of migrants has more than doubled. Some of the causes of increased migration include civil wars, the collapse of states, persons fleeing violence and persecution, and the desire of people to move from poor societies to more prosperous countries. Since most international migration is carried out legally, official migration presents few problems. To regulate transnational migration, governments establish rules and systems to facilitate the regular admission and exit of persons. When a person enters a foreign country or returns to their homeland, for example, their passport is stamped, in effect acknowledging the government's consent for admission and exit. The vast majority of migration in our world today is short-term and temporary, when people travel for business or tourism. Some migration, however, involves medium-term duration of 2 to 6 years to supplement the labor force in areas such as farming, service industries, and skilled professions. Finally, some persons seek to move permanently to a foreign country, that is, to immigrate. Since countries have an interest in the long-term configuration of their citizenry, governments establish rules and criteria to govern the issuing of immigrant visas. In the case of the United States, for example, our laws allow a maximum of 675 immigrant visas annually, with about 70% of these going for family reunification. According to international law, people have a basic right to leave their homeland, but they do not have a right to enter a foreign land. Because states are sovereign, the decision to admit a migrant is in the hands of the receiving state. In short, people have a fundamental right to emigrate, but not to immigrate. And since the demand for visas is much greater than their available supply, people resort to covert strategies to enter or remain in developed states. It is estimated that at least 5 million people are currently in European countries without legal authorization. In the case of the United States, the number is more than double that. Although some people don't regard irregular migration as a problem, a growing number of citizens in developed countries around the world are expressing political disapproval of the government's failure to regulate migration. This dissatisfaction has been expressed in the rise of populist movements in democratic states. In my view, Brexit succeeded because of immigration concerns, and the rise of populist movements in Germany and France is fueled by immigration issues. And Donald Trump is president in part because he called for stricter border controls. Is illegal migration a problem for democratic states? I could just pose here a parenthetical question. Is illegal migration a problem for Christians? But I will not address that issue. I'm going to keep going because I didn't write my reflections on that. While small-scale irregular migration has been accepted by many countries, mass migration poses a more significant concern because it threatens social solidarity and undermines the rule of law. This was evident in Germany in 2015 when more than 800,000 refugees, most fleeing the Syrian civil war, entered the country. When Chancellor Merkel announced that Germany would accept Syrian and other refugees arriving at its borders, she unwittingly undermined the existing European Union system of migration. At the time, Germany was part of a borderless system established with the Schengen Accords, which required that refugees needed to be registered in the country where they first entered Europe. This meant that processing needed to be carried out chiefly by Italy and Greece. Thus, while Germany's action was compassionate, it was not strategic. And this is why Alexander Betz and Paul Collier, two Oxford University scholars, describe Merkel's approach as a headless heart. Before examining how a Christian perspective might contribute to the policy debate over migration, let me highlight an issue that I raised earlier, namely, how to conceive of the world. Is the world a global society of states, or is it an international community of people? These alternative visions or worldviews can be defined as communitarianism and cosmopolitanism. The communitarian view views the world as a community of nation states. By contrast, the cosmopolitan views the world as a community of global citizens and emphasizes the equality and universality of persons. Since the Christian should acknowledge both the centrality of social life and the universality of God's love, I believe a Christian approach to migration should be rooted in both the global ambitions of cosmopolitanism and the social solidarity found in communitarianism. How best to integrate these two worldviews will vary from one time and place to another. Does the Christian faith provide values and resources to help assess international migration? I believe that it does. Earlier, I identified a number of principles and teachings that are part of the Christian political ethics. Elements from the biblical code most applicable to migration include the centrality of human dignity, the universality of God's love, the need for justice, the importance of social solidarity, and the need to care for the poor and the vulnerable. While the Bible does not offer specific guidance on international migration, Christian ethics can remind decision makers that all persons must be treated justly and with dignity. Let me just say parenthetically here that since I retired, I've been working with a number of families who are refugees, and one of the great blessings of my life is currently my assisting an Afghan family that came legally to our country. And if I can just say also parenthetically, I was driving the family to get some inoculations, and I raised the question of, when you pray, do you ask Allah for something, or what do you do? Oh, she says, this is Roma, we never ask God for anything. He said, we always say, thank you. And you know what? My heart was touched profoundly, because I thought I, as a Christian, should be far more expressing in gratitude to God Almighty in my prayers than I do. So it's amazing how you can learn as you seek to serve others. I apologize. I don't know what's gotten him. It's been a long day for me. Are you still with me? While compassion and mercy can contribute to a welcoming perspective, establishing admission criteria will inevitably involve the difficult task of making trade-offs among competing moral values. For example, who should have legal precedence? Refugees or economic migrants? Immigrant visa holders or irregular migrants already in country? Skill-based workers or family members? And if you're a government official, you can't say yes to all that. You have to choose. And that's the issue of how the Christian faith can contribute. It has to provide a framework for dealing with these competing moral values. In my book, Just Immigration, I examined a number of church documents that influenced the policy debate. Most of these were unhelpful because they were more concerned with advocacy than with highlighting relevant Christian values. Unlike the Catholic bishop's pastoral letter on deterrence, the claims and assertions for most church documents fail to provide an informed and nuanced moral analysis of the problems posed by mass migration. Indeed, the only document that seemed to provide a theological analysis was the 2012 study, Immigrants Among Us, issued by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. The study was helpful because it illuminates the theological ethics relevant to immigration and thereby provides an invaluable resource on how to address this issue from a Christian perspective. Like the bishop's pastoral letter on nuclear arms, this study succeeds because it illuminates and applies theological ethics and doesn't focus on advocacy. Let me conclude with some summary thoughts. At the outset, I raised the question, can the church contribute to global peace and prosperity? Given what I have suggested, let me say that the answer is a conditional yes. It is conditional because several preconditions must be met. Let me summarize them. 1, believers must distinguish between the kingdom of God and the demands of the kingdom of the earth and give precedence to the former over the latter. 2, the Bible provides principles, perspectives, and moral rules that serve as a map to guide political analysis. It is not a manual on public policy. When applying Christian morality to political concerns, believers should illuminate biblical values and principles. 4, believers must be knowledgeable about politics and government and the specific issues being addressed. And 5, believers should avoid oversimplifying complex social and political issues. As a result, they should avoid providing categorical moral verdicts. And 6, given the complexity of national and global issues, the organized church should refrain from giving policy recommendations. If you have followed my argument, I'm encouraging believers to be involved in domestic and international affairs, To be effective, individuals must work with others to shape and influence political action. Let me conclude my talk by just quoting parts of a last paragraph of my book. Christians are called to love and serve their neighbor. They can do so through individual acts of caring, such as assisting a refugee family, supporting a homeless shelter, or providing food for the poor. They can also do so through governmental organizations and NGOs. Because public institutions establish and implement society-wide policies to address national and global concerns, public service vocations provide an important means of demonstrating concern for the well-being of others. While all persons have distinct interests, capabilities, and resources, everybody can contribute something to the welfare of others. The gift could be time, money, knowledge, skills, or the intangibles of love and care. The recipients could be family members, neighbors, church members, citizens, or foreign individuals. The common good is advanced in everyday life, at home and at work, as individuals serve and care for one another and bring hope to people facing intractable problems. Our world will become more peaceful, harmonious, and prosperous if we make service to others a more important part of our own lives. And it will be a source of profound joy as we share with others what God has entrusted to us. Thank you.
You can just take a seat over there. I'm sorry you are allergic to Greenville, but spring has sort of begun to spring, whatever, and I can feel it as well too, so I'm sorry. He came down from Chicago. It's still snowing up there. It is now time for our panel, and I want to introduce to you our our additional panel participants. Peter Fever, and you can come on up and grab a microphone. Peter Fever is professor of political science and public policy at Duke University. He is director of the Duke Program in American Grand Strategy and co-principal investigator of the America in the World Consortium. He was educated at Lehigh University and Harvard University. Professor Fever is an accomplished scholar. You can read his list of publications in the brochure, but also an experienced policymaker. From June 2005 to July 2007, Professor Fever served as special advisor for strategic planning and institutional reform on the National Security Council staff at the White House, where his responsibilities included the national security strategy. And that wasn't the most recent one, right? No. That was one a little further back. You may have read the most recent one. Regional strategy reviews and other political military issues. In 1993-94, Professor Fever served as Director for Defense Policy and Arms Control on the National Security Council at the White House. Many of you may be familiar with him from the pages of Foreign Affairs, where he publishes frequently. And just a note right there, you heard Mark talk about the desire to see people working into public service, and he certainly was preaching that when I was at Wheaton. I took a different route, but Peter here marries both. He's both a scholar, policymaker, public intellectual, so he can speak in many different ways. Now, Larry Richter is not a professor, but he was certainly a public servant. He retired as a senior Foreign Service officer with the Department of State in September 2020 after 33 years and assignments in 10 countries on 4 continents, ranging from Armenia to Zimbabwe. In his last 4 overseas assignments, he served as Minister Counselor for Management in Afghanistan, London, Tokyo, and again in Afghanistan. Now, where are the most important places in the world in, the last 10, 15 years? Those places. And Larry was running the show in those places. Among his more interesting assignments, he served in Rwanda during the Civil War from 1991 to 93, and then returned for 2 months to reopen the embassy immediately after the genocide. He also served as acting deputy chief of mission in the U.S. mission to the UN in Geneva for 15 months at the beginning of the Obama administration as the U.S. rejoined the UN Human Rights Council and negotiated the New START treaty with Russia, which has ended as of last week, right? Oh, you must have shed tears for that one. Now, he actually personally procured the infamous reset button that only the old people around here will understand what this means, that Secretary Clinton presented to Russian Foreign Secretary Lavrov by taking the emergency stop button from the hotel hot tub while the people were in there, and they were not happy when he left. So he can tell that story. Anyway, he is a recipient of several meritorious and superior honor awards. He also was named Management Officer of the Year and was awarded presidential pay for meritorious service. And he's a personal friend. I graduated from high school with Larry. I graduated from college with Larry. And we continue to keep up on an amazing relationship. I even visited him in London and got the tour of the old embassy. Now they've got the new one, which Larry did build. So let's welcome our panelists. Okay, I'm going to start with Peter and go to Larry. What in Mark's presentation do you want to underline, do you want to take issue with, struck you as particularly profound, or something else you want to tell us about?
Well, I'm in violent agreement with Mark on the overarching thrust of his argument, but I just want to push on a couple where I think, I'm not saying we disagree, but where it might be more interesting to draw in the audience. The 3 points. First, when I'm talking about these issues, I say, as Christians, we hold principles tightly and policies lightly. And I think that is a way of summarizing your argument. You leaned in on the principles, but then you leaned backwards when it came to the policies, and that's as it should be. I think the value of the individual is something that we can all agree to, or we all should agree to, as a Christian. But what does that mean for the choosing who gets to come into the country, which is a policy question? And you would think, well, the value of the individual should make it clear. And here's my second point. It's not so clear when it comes to immigration. So a senior Trump administration official explained the immigration theory that this administration is following to me this way. He said that we meaning the U.S. government, the current administration, want only to bring in the very best of the best. So those who can compete at the tippy top, the 0.1% on different measures. Now, wealth would be one of the measures that they measure, but also intellectual achievement and artistic achievement. The rest, he said, want to come to America, but they shouldn't come because they're not the best. Now, I heard that argument. I said, yeah, I understand that that's at least a rule that you can understand how to apply that, but how to square that with the idea of the inherent indignity that there is no distinction between me, an ordinary person, and somebody who is the tippy top. On the other hand, as you pointed out, you can't admit everybody. So you're going to be picking arbitrarily anyway. So if not ranking people by how valuable you think they are, what is the criteria? And that, of course, is the nub of the policy question. And I don't think as Christians we can wash our hands of it. If our principles have any purchase, they must empower us to speak to that issue. What we may find out, though, is two principled Christians disagreeing all the way to heaven on this issue. And they'll argue, if they still care about it, they'll be arguing about it in heaven. They won't care about it by that point. My last point, of course, the Syrian immigration problem you identified, which you're absolutely right, was the catalyst for Brexit and the decline of EU. It was the unintended consequence of a different policy problem, which is how do we manage the Arab Spring? And so this has been Larry's business for decades, and those of us in the government is the second and third and fourth order consequences, almost always unintended. So President Obama had a principled approach to the Arab Spring that was based on a very realist calculation of American power and what we could and could not do. The unintended consequence of that was mass chaos inside Syria and a migration crisis that the EU couldn't handle. You don't blame that on the U.S. administration, but you recognize that when you're assessing, well, if you start the clock then 5 years earlier, what should we do in the Arab Spring? Maybe you have to weigh these second and third future order consequences into your moral calculation, which of course is very, very hard to do because no one could be sure that that would happen. So those would be my three observations. I'll stop.
Thank you. Mark, we'll let you respond, but after Larry gets his chance, and then I'll give you the chance to respond to both of them. Okay? Larry.
Yeah, two brief thoughts. One, just kind of a parenthetical comment on immigration and how to think about it, especially in light of so much of the recent controversy. One of the things that I think has to be taken into account when it comes to illegal immigration or unauthorized migration is the unseen cost of those that are making their way here through those channels that aren't authorized. The human trafficking that results, the contribution that it makes to organized crime in the countries that people are passing through, the sex trafficking, the separation of families as children are taken from their parents by the smugglers, and those sorts of things. An open border encourages those things and results in an awful lot of misery that we don't see, even as we see the consequences of trying to, of what the current administration is doing in several cities around the U.S. But the main thing that I was struck by was early on in your talk, Mark, about the role of Christians in public service. One of the things that really struck me when I joined State Department and met so many of my colleagues there, I'm somebody that grew up in at least a nominally Christian community, and then later on in a much more intensely evangelical community, going to a Christian college, ending up as a missionary for a while and seminary. I was steeped in a religious milieu and just sort of was conversant with Christianity's role in history and society, that sort of thing. I was really struck when I came into State Department at how, for want of a better word, religiously illiterate most of my colleagues were. Really smart people, really motivated people, but seeing religious thought as something that was at best mostly irrelevant, and at worst something to be overcome in order to come to, a proper ordering of society. And I think the role of Christians as salt and light in transforming society is really crucial. Just in the conversations that where I feel like in some ways had some of the most influence was just helping the people to understand that the world that we live in is not normal. It's not a given. It's not the way things just automatically are and have been. It's a world that has been transformed by religion, in the West, especially by Christianity. But that it is a fundamental part of the way that our societies are ordered. And it's important to understand what those transformations have been, what those underpinnings are, and not to just see them as something that's normal, because I do believe that the veneer of civilization everywhere is very, very thin, and a world without those religious underpinnings is a world that is a much less attractive world than the one that we do live in.
Just to underline what you just said, I heard a presentation on the 1979 Iranian Revolution and how clueless the American diplomatic corps was to how important religion was in Iran. And they missed everything. They had to get back up to speed really fast. Okay,
It's
Mark.
actually a big part of our problem in Afghanistan too, I think.
Yeah, and let's get to that in a few minutes. But Mark, we got migration and religion as a whole in our world.
Well, I deeply appreciate Peter's comments and Larry's comments. I would just say that as a person who sought to teach politics, my interest always was not just on goals and intentions, but outcomes. And I think that one of the problems with when churchmen begin pontificating about any of these issues, one of the problems is they may have competence in biblical and theological ethics, but they don't know what Professor Fever teaches his graduate students on public policy and grand strategy. And so look, I am really concerned about our country and our world and the question of what can believers, people who go to church, what can they do to make the world a tad better? And my bottom conclusion, you see, is that we don't want to go down the highway of the Federal Council, the National Council of Churches that was pontificating in the 70s and 80s on every conceivable Ronald Reagan initiative. I spent a couple times speaking at the Presbyterian annual meetings, General Assembly meetings on issues, and I felt some of those preachers didn't have a clue. They hadn't been to the Soviet Union. They didn't know the totalitarian society, and they were pontificating. Evangelicals eventually caught the bug from mainline churches, and then they started pontificating about issues, climate change. And my concern is that some of this pontification does more damage than good, and if they did more of the fundamental work of building the moral culture of society and infusing Christian morality, that it'd be farther. So I'm not responding specifically to these. I'm simply saying that my talk comes from a deep concern that I want to live out the Christian faith and how to make the world better. And one of the ways that we can make it better is by doing less on the public policy side and much more on the fundamental moral teaching side.
Okay, well, this really does raise the next question I wanted to address, and that is this role of the church as a whole versus Christians who are in the church. And, I think we're in a particular moment now when there are an awful lot of people who say, I want to hear more politics from the pulpit, either from the left or from the right. I want my church to take a stand on whether it be some moral issue or on some foreign policy issue. And so there's that desire for sort of a collective voice versus what seems like a more, I will say, just a more Protestant perspective of individuals getting out there and working hard and being great Christians, but not really collectively getting anything done. So, how do you wrestle with that? And I'll let the others address that too, if that's a question that you're interested in. Mark, how do you wrestle with that? The church needs to speak into the culture, and it has to do so collectively and loudly. Or is it just individuals working alone?
No, I don't want the Baptist church in Greenville or the First Presbyterian church in Greenville mouthing off on and giving a sermon on what to do about borders and immigration. I don't want them telling, that we all should buy Teslas like my colleague here. I think there's really important, I think the church needs to model how to talk one to the other about these issues. And when I did interviews in Rwanda, one of the things I learned is that the formal church hadn't done a deep job, an effective job of what I call Christian formation. And the task of the church is to form Christian citizens, Christian minds, to think Christianly about this. And so I want preachers preaching about the relevance of the Beatitudes, about being salt and light, and allude to the challenges. But I don't want them stepping into the political realm, because that can undermine the task of the church. So I come back to, I think Michael Novak's model of three concentric systems is really very helpful. The underlying framework is of a moral cultural system. And if we get that right, is Christian nationalism of people who are jumping up and down for Trump helpful? I don't think it is. I think it undermines the gospel, and it has nothing to do with Trump. It has simply to, basically, you're placing the kingdom of the earth above the kingdom of God. And as I said, if you're going to be effective, you have to be able to separate and distinguish between those two realms. And that's what Christian maturity is, after all.
Either one of you want to take that up, or?
Well, only to say that I think certainly you can be Christian on the right or Christian on the left, but wrestling with the fundamental issues of what does it mean to be conformed to the mind of God, thinking through deeply, not what do I think about this particular, or what am I being told to do about this particular issue that's in front of me, but rather how do I think Christianly. I may come up with very different answers than a fellow brother or sister, but if we're wrestling with the questions, at least there's, rather than simply the outcome, it seems to me to be a Christian way to do it.
Yeah, Mark.
In heaven, there will be people who were baptized as infants and people who were immersed as adults. And if on the core issue of baptism there's pluralism, that we can do with much more pluralism on these social and political issues.
And I'll just add that when they get to heaven, they'll be surprised how much organ music there is at the center. But I'm old-fashioned in that. I share Mark's concern about the carelessness with which church leaders blaspheme, by which I mean they attach the Lord's name in vain to policies that I'm confident they have not ground adequately in Scripture. That's blasphemy. That's taking the Lord's name in vain. And as Christians, we should be wary about doing so. That said, there are moments when the church needs to be prophetic. And especially those moments are when the society and the entrenched power of the state seems so overwhelming. You invoked Dietrich Bonhoeffer or the apartheid era. Those were courageous moments when the church could be prophetic. We need to as Christians, be attuned to it. In my experience, I think this is probably what Mark was referring to, so many of the churches that leaned into policy arguments over the last 4 or 5 decades seem to be more zealous in preaching the policy than in preaching the gospel. And I wanted to go to their services and say, when is the gospel being preached in this service? I'm blessed to be in a church that is remarkably diverse. So it's one of the few politically diverse congregations one can find in Durham. As we know, that Sunday morning is a very segregated moment politically and racially. This happens to be a majority African American church that includes the Republican county chairman, black, and also the Democratic state representative. So there is a wide political diversity. And in that congregation, I'm impressed by how rarely the pastors from the pulpit speak to politics. They just don't. Even though every 4 years, a significant fraction of the church leaves, some because they felt they didn't speak enough into the politics. So it's just an extremely thorny process for a church like that. But I feel blessed to be a part of it.
I want to go back to foreign affairs, and then with one question, then I'm going to ask you all for your questions. I was really struck, Mark, by when you said, a better world means strong states that are good. Now, I study the European Union, and after World War II, there was a real sense that we needed to get beyond the nation state. In fact, there were books called Beyond the Nation State, right? And at the core of the European Union, there's still this notion that if we can weaken borders, actually open borders, to trade, to goods, to people, to money, we will actually grow broader and deeper at the same time, and we will become the good society that is without nation states. So you're telling me that all those generations of good Europeans, good federalists, are wrong about this, and that the best world is one with strong nation states, but somehow they are transformed into good actors. So I want you to flesh that out, and then I want to hear Larry and Peter on that particular question. Is the world better with strong states that are good?
I don't know what God's intended in making this world and what kinds of political communities, whether we should have empires or, feudal kingdoms. I'm agnostic on that. I just know that from an empirical standpoint that if you want prosperity and you want human rights, the only way that I know from history in the past, say, 75 years, is to have states that are reasonably effective in maintaining the rule of law and facilitating policies that foster prosperity. So I'm well acquainted with the dreams of the EU, the creation of the common market. The notion was that somehow they would overcome the limitations of nationalism and the parochialism of nation states. I think that somehow if the EU was really thriving and they had been able to develop a more effective set of policies and institutions that could address not just trade issues and production issues, but dealt with some of the human rights. There are enormous problems with how to conceive of human rights and how to think about them. So the reason why I conclude that I want an effective state that also is a humane state is I don't see the alternative right now. And so it's not that I think the UN has established the perfect system. I don't. I have great problems with the system, but I don't know of a better way. And since I'm a principled realist, I sort of hark back to, okay, what's feasible to work, and just in my travels, and if you see life on the ground, if you go to Cuba and you go to Vietnam, you see certain things that are radically different, and one works, the other doesn't. And so it's in that context, it's an empirical, not so much a normative view. So I think maybe the word strong is not the appropriate word. I want an effective state that, in fact, does what governments are supposed to do, which is make and enforce and interpret rules that foster justice.
Peter?
So you made the choice between strong states that are good or a transnational organization like the EU. I might choose strong states that are good, but the choice that Europe faced was strong states that were not good. So the EU came out of the experience of a balance of power system that was dominated by some very evil regimes, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, and then some decrepit regimes, particularly the Third Republic in France. And so I would say the EU was demonstrably better than what they had had for the previous several years. But what made that system work was a strong United States that was a public goods provider. That's, to me, the essential ingredient for a stable global order. That's been the essential ingredient. And of course, the U.S. has made mistakes. You've had to clean up from those mistakes over a career. But we have been so much better than the historical examples of leading states in previous periods. And so that's where I put my focus. That's what my research is on American grand strategy. How can we keep the United States as a force for good in the world rather than a force for evil or worse?
Larry?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly understand in the aftermath of the trauma of World War II, looking at this utopian vision of why can't we all
Just
get along in one world. I do think that a lot of the strains that you see that have developed in the EU as they've gone for more and more commonality are because people don't feel heard in their particular political subsets or countries that they're in, and they feel as though those are being usurped. Certainly that was what was happening with Brexit, is the people in England, many of them just felt as though their culture, their sovereignty was being overwhelmed in a way that was very unfavorable for them. As far as good states and that sort of thing, my time in Geneva, we referred where the UN has about 50 of its organizations in Geneva, a lot of the working groups, everything from the World Meteorological Association and Universal Postal Union and that sort of thing are there. We kind of categorized those 50 as the good, the bad, and the ugly, because you have a lot of malign actors in the world, and many of them try to take over institutions that would either try to undercut them, the Human Rights Council being one of the best examples, or they try to get in and subvert them to their own needs, to the detriment of others. So there is a need for good, strong polities to be actively working to try to maintain the systems that we have and to improve them.
Tell us just briefly about Afghanistan, and I'm assuming we're not counting that as one of the strong good states.
No.
But just your experience in trying to build an Afghanistan that was going to stand.
Well, I think we clearly underestimated the power of religion, ideology in Afghanistan. We and did not understand the staying power of people who believed fervently in religion or an ideology that was in fundamental opposition to what we believed was good for the people of Afghanistan. And I think in part because we didn't take that as seriously as we should have, we didn't see much of what was happening throughout the country. I was there twice, 2011 to 12 and 2018 to 20. 2011 to 12, we were still very, very active in the country. We had, this was the height of the surge. We had 4 consulates, 8 provincial reconstruction teams. We had State Department personnel embedded in 92 different locations and that sort of thing. By the time I went back in 2018 to 2020, we had really withdrawn just to Kabul, and we had lost touch with much of what was going on in the country. So we just didn't have the access to it that we had had previously. But even at the height, we did not understand the intensity of the opposition, I think. I have my own opinions about what should have happened there. I don't think we should have left, but that's a longer discussion.
Ooh, that would be a longer discussion. We shouldn't have left. Okay, we're going to hang that there and get to your questions. So I'm going to start with Nathan in the back. I'll go to Daniel and then David. Yeah, and why don't you, all three of you, just give your questions out, and then we'll let the panel respond to them. So Nathan first.
Well, hey guys, I'm Nathan. Thank you so much for coming. Main question I had for any of the panelists was, you're getting at this question between when should the church be prophetic and when should it sort of avoid taking a strong policy stance. And many of the churches that have in the past and currently are taking a policy stance believe that there are a quintessential moment where they should take a stand, whether that was like the Bonhoeffer in the past or it's sort of like MAGA voters in the present. And so, what would you guys recommend as like heuristics that Christians should think through to decide whether or not the issues or the stakes are high enough to make that stance, given that everyone who says it already believes that it is high enough?
Daniel? Just stand up so we can hear you. Thank you.
You talked about how perhaps one better way for the church to approach this issue is to focus on teaching moral judgment rather than holding specific policy positions. How then should the church teach policy positions, teach moral judgment in a world that maybe has lost interest in Christian morality without requiring a change to the education system that could violate the separation of church and state?
Okay, and David?
What kept popping into my mind throughout the presentation was, what about Pope Leo XIV? His messages seem to...
Recent, yeah, his recent, yeah. Yeah, good. Okay, you get to choose. Mark, do you want to start us off here?
I did not hear the last.
What about Pope Leo XIV and his recent statements? Do they meet the Mark Amstutz standard?
Which statement?
Your standard of
Yeah, but what was the?
Pope Leo XIV.
And
I think I'll just start by saying that I think both Pope Francis and Pope Leo have not adequately addressed the issue. I'll give you just one illustration. When Pope Francis sent a letter to the U.S. bishops in the United States, encouraging them to be more involved in a profound way. It wasn't policy advice, but he referred to, in his letter to the bishops, he talked about there were immigrants, unlawful immigrants, and then there were criminal immigrants. Well, look, if you enter the United States without inspection, that's a misdemeanor, but it's part of the criminal code. It's part of the criminal code. And the very fact that that Pope Francis failed to understand, he was lumping, basically, he was trying to give a pass to people who were just normally living out their lives, trying to get a better job. And so I think, so I'm asking very specific on that, but on the issue of how do we identify something that gets to the level of a prophetic nature, I think that's a really, really key issue. And I think in our society, we're getting close to that point. That's my view. My view is that I think we're getting at a point where there are some issues of such fundamental nature that the church needs to help us to think about those issues. I would just, I know this gives you a very personal view of ethics, but when a candidate says there are two genders, to my way of thinking, that's sort of consistent with what I understand a man and a woman to be from a Christian worldview. And I would like the church, these issues of sexuality, the cultural issues, I think I need help from Christian thinkers who are thinking about transgender, the issue of transgender for minors. Once again, this is not foreign policy, but so all I'm saying is that I think we're getting to the point where some of these issues are of fundamental threat to the witness and the life of Christian people. I don't know what those are, but I'm saying that as somebody, I think the needs today for the Christian witness to our culture is greater today than it was 50 years ago.
Okay, how about moral education? Or you want to go?
Well, my stab at your first question would be two rules. One is the church should speak more loudly to the church than to the society. And so I would have church leaders calling out other church leaders who are blaspheming rather than calling out politicians. It may come to that, but that's where I'd begin. The second, more practical test, before you speak out on an issue, have you befriended somebody who's on the other side of the issue? And that, I think, is not happening enough in the United States. We don't have enough friend relations with people who cancel our vote on election day. And so before you get too far down the road of thus saith the Lord, your policy on tariffs is wrong, you should befriend somebody who has the other view and hear them out. And you'll find that may soften some of the changes. In an answer to your observation, I actually think that it is possible for the church to speak in general knowledge terms without the biblical speech, without the jargon. When I'm caring for my students, I'm at a secular university. I'm caring for them, motivated by my view of them as Imago Dei, but I'm not layering in all of that Christian language and jargon onto my interactions with them. I actually think this is the future of pedagogy at elite universities. If you spend a little time playing around with large language models, that is a mortal threat to higher education. And so how are we going to justify paying Brent enough to buy Teslas only if what he's involved in is more than just something that ChatGPT could deliver faster than he can. If he's involved in the moral formation of young adolescents and taking them to late adolescence, which is a lot more than downloading information into their brain, only then will higher education survive. And so I think we're going to have to move in that direction. Christians have a lot to do. That gets really close to the original Christian vision for the university. And so we can be doing that whether we're talking that way or not.
Last word, Larry?
Only that having been outside of the U.S. for roughly 25 of those 33 years, I really have been struck at how de-Christianized the United States has gotten in that time. And in large part, I think it's because the church has lost its authority because of its own internal failings. So I do think that there's a need for confession rather than defensiveness. The Catholic Church would be, the most obvious example with the whole problem that they had with pedophiles and that sort of thing, but certainly within the Protestant Church and the sexual immorality and that sort of thing. Church has to clean up its act in order to be heard by people who right now have kind of written it off, not just kind of, in a way that was not true in the 70s and the 80s when seems much more immediate to me because there has been this disjunction for me in terms of seeing how the culture has been responding and the influences on the culture. The church has become a much less influential voice, and I think it's self-inflicted.
I hear you, and I have a Tesla for sale. This
We
is
really
all
threw you under the bus.
right. Twice. I've been run over twice. This is all a great advertisement for Tocqueville Fellows and Beaumont Fellows, because we do talk about these things, and there are a bunch of fellows back there, and we disagree a lot, and we sharpen each other as we wrestle through these particular issues. So if you want moral formation, if you want to go deeper, if you want to learn how to argue these things through, join us. All right, tomorrow night, Dr. Peter Fever will be discussing the U.S. military and culture wars in Watkins over there at 5 o'clock, and I'm sure you will all want to be there. Let's give our panelists a round of applause, and you are dismissed.